Sakuragar, I am the Man-Darian and welcome to my channel. Please just call me Darian because that is my actual name. Today we are in part 2 of the Mythosaur Skull build. I chose Bo-Katan's Night Owl Mythosaur. I think that's a pretty cool version of it, but I've added a little bit of my own take to it while keeping it true to the original, as you can see in the screen in front of you right now. This video is more the filing, beveling, and polishing of the Mythosaur Skull, more the finishing work. So get yourself a file. The one I just showed is actually not what I'll be using to start. This is a round file. Now, when you begin to file, you only want to do it on the push stroke if you're holding the file by the tang or the handle. I shouldn't be handling it with my bare hand like I am, because the oils will actually degrade the file over time, but this file is older than I am, believe it or not. I'm not too worried, and it's going to be replaced in the near future. I decided to start with all of the interior sides. If I make any mistakes, I'm not going over a completed area. Generally use a round or half round file on anything that is concave, because a flat file will only touch small areas in that, whereas on a convex or flat section, it hits a lot more areas. So use the right tool for the right job. Having options is great. I tried to limit myself to as few files as possible for this to make it easier for people without tools to be able to do this project. So what I'm doing here is I'm starting at the edge on a 30-degree angle, and I'm pushing towards the nose, slowly decreasing my angles until I hit the flat. And what that does is I slowly create a channel with my file that is straight and in the same place. It's a very sharp channel that gets me to where I eventually want to be. I will bring this down slowly over time by doing it on such an extreme angle from the edge. I only have one file line to follow. If you were to try and do this on the flat, you'd get all kinds of lines. It would be very hard to keep in one solid area. So this is just a little trick to get that a little better. And here, what I'm doing is I'm using the edge of the file like a scribe. There are better tools for this, but again, I'm trying to keep the barrier for entry to this as low as possible and show you solutions in case you break your scribe or don't have one or whatever. So I'm just using it like it's a pencil, the sharp, very tip of the file, and I was tracing the lines of my design in small little increments and then slowly increasing the size of the increments, so that I get a defined path I want to go through. Now here, I'm using a slightly different method, and I'm using the very edge of the skull and the eye socket, and I'm taking away material with the file, keeping the edge of the skull as my boundary and my guide, so that I know that I can bring down the material on either end of this line that I'm creating slowly over time in order to get a nice beveled area. I am trying to keep as sharp of a step as possible in this particular section. I've rounded off the areas near the horn and the eye socket, but the upper skull and the side of the skull, I want to have a nice sharp step. On the horn section here, I'm creating a round bevel because I want it to look a little bit more organic than the rest. And I accomplish this by constantly changing the angle in which I'm filing. So I'm going for that naturally rounded off curve. But on this intersection here, I'm doing a sharp, probably about 20 degrees I would think, angle. And I'm going to have it actually as a medium bevel because I don't want it to be something you can catch your finger on, but I also don't want it to look organic because the center of the skull, I'm trying to keep more of a mechanical look. So I want it to look like a tool rather than something that was pulled out of the ground. Don't be afraid to go back and redefine lines that you're working on. Sometimes you don't put them exactly where you want, if you're not deep enough, so that's just what I'm doing here. I'm redefining that horn line that goes to the skull. So in cases where you don't need the pattern after you've cut out and you want to take the paper off, all you have to do is submerge it in water for a few seconds and it comes right off. It's very simple. I just left this pattern on for this particular piece because I wanted all of the lines to file against. You might be wondering why I'm going back over this area now with the round file instead of the flat file. Well, I want to give these teeth a little bit more of an organic look so that the organic from the teeth goes more to hard lines as it goes further towards the top of the skull, kind of giving it a transition from machine to mechanical. I love biomechanical. My father actually introduced me to H.R. Giger's works very early on in life, and I gotta say, even though you wouldn't see it in my art generally, it is one of my major influences. He's an artist that I've always really appreciated. The other being Ed Roth would be another large one, but when I tell people that and they look at my art, they don't see it. So maybe it's more of a aspiration and envy that they found their own paths, but there you have it. Now that my paths are a little bit more defined, I'm going to start beveling the teeth into different layers. I've actually chosen to do this in 3 different layers so that the center right tooth is actually the deepest in the sculpture and the outside teeth are the highest, because I figure they don't have orthodontists for these animals if they were still to exist. And so the teeth wouldn't be perfect. I wanted to give it just another thing that would make this unique compared to the other mythosaur skulls that you see out there. Part of the reason you see me going back over areas multiple times and going to and from certain areas is in cutting and filing. You can always take away more, but you can never put anything back. I mean, I could weld this, but that's a lot of effort that I really don't want to have to do. So I go in cycles, going back and forth, seeing how everything looks together, then deciding if I want to take more away from a certain area, because compared to another area now, it looks like it's very subtle. So it's trying to find the balance in the piece. That's why I go back and forth. Sometimes if you go too far in definition on one section, it always glares no matter how far you go with other sections. I'm going to jump forward here. Now, you'll notice that there's no longer paper on the left side. I did all of that with my Fordham. I just decided that this video was going to be way too long and that I would only show you half because it's the same process left to right. In future videos, I will show you how to use a Fordham. I just want to keep this as simple and quick as possible, and it's still going to be probably a 20-minute video, if not longer. So, in metalwork, there is a saying, in particular in jewelry, that the last 10% of a project takes 90% of the time. Which leads us into the final chapter for this project, sanding and polishing. I'm not really going to polish this project because aluminum isn't lean into polishing well, but let's talk about some theory about how to sand. Go one direction with your 80 grit, say this way. When you switch grits to your 120, you want to cross the path that you've currently gone with your 80 grit, so that way you know that you've removed all the tooling marks from the previous grit as you go along. It's going to be hard with this project because it's not a straight back and forth piece. There's so many curves and there's so many details. I've added a lot of levels to each section, so it's going to look kind of weird, but I am at least changing on like a 20-degree direction every time I change the path. I change grits. Something to bear in mind, every time you change grits, you are trying to remove the tooling from the previous grit. And if there's any infestation from a previous sandpaper, say in the corner of one of the grooves or in between your saw marks or whatever, then that can come out later as you're sanding, so you really want to make sure to clean your piece in between each grit that you are going to. So, and then for those of you that don't know, the higher the number of the grit, the finer it is in detail. So 80 grit is a very coarse sandpaper, whereas 400 grit is a fairly fine sandpaper. Well, here's a neat trick so that you don't round off your edges when you're working on the steps. I'm putting the side of my sandpaper, when it comes to that top section by the skull, I'm making sure that I'm only doing the bottom layer. If you're trying to do the top layer and the bottom layer, you're going to round off and bevel the edge between the two ends of the skull. So I do them each separate. It's something that you're going to have to do each layer, but the quality of the step is going to really pop when you get to your finished product. Then down here, it doesn't matter nearly as much because I want these rounded edges. I want every part to have a bevel and blend in together somewhat because they're supposed to be organic teeth that are mixing together. So it's kind of, you have to figure out each section, what it needs and how to do the process as you go along. I generally do have a plan ahead of time, but sometimes it changes as I get more and more into each piece. I forgot to do the interior of all of the cutouts. I should have done this first, but because we're at such a low grit, it doesn't matter as much. There's something more to keep in mind for later when you're working up with the higher number of sandpapers. It's going to be more and more apparent as you go along that you did this in the wrong sequence, and you want your flat, large surface that the people will be staring at to be the last thing in your sequence for each grit of sandpaper, because you want it to be as perfect as possible. So if you've made tooling marks for the sandpaper because you ended up doing the edges last, then it's going to stand out more. And also when you're doing your edges, you're way more likely to scratch a surface that you're not working on than you are when you're on the flats. The flats generally keep it from scratching the edges. Alright, here's where we transition from 80 grit into 120 grit. Every time that you finish with a grit, the idea is you don't want to go more than double what the previous grit was. So at 80, you go to 160 or 120, depending on what you have available to you. From 120, the most you want to go to is 240, but I think 200 is what I have, so probably end up going there. From 200, you go to 400, so forth and so on. If you go more than that, it ends up being a level of work not worth the jump, and quite often you have to go back and downgrade your sandpaper anyways, so it's better to just stick to the doubling up rule, double up or less. After doing the edges, you generally should get in all the nooks and crannies first, and then work the larger flat surfaces. As you go up in grit, you're also going to notice that the sandpaper doesn't last as long. It either gets gummed up faster or it burns out faster, especially if you're using the black wet sandpaper. It really burns out a lot faster at the higher grits. That's just because it's got less to hold on with, and so it's just going to naturally happen. So you will find when you get up to like 400 grit and whatnot that you're going to be using at least double, if not triple, the sandpaper that you did at 240. As you get up in the grits, it's better to take long strokes as much as possible, going from one edge to the other. Every time you stop halfway or start somewhere in the middle, it's going to leave a different direction scratch, and it's going to get more noticeable the further along you go. At this point, it's not too integral, but I just try and keep that as a habit whenever possible. It's not always possible, especially on a complicated shape like this. Now this is your last chance to deburr back of the piece. I like a nice sharp edge for the back, but you don't want it so sharp that it could cut the wall or a person handling it or whatever. At about 120, that's where I just give it a little chamfer. Make sure that it's not too sharp, but you still got pretty close to a 90-degree corner. And now we are on to the 240 grit. Yay! This is where it starts to get a little bit more important to clean every layer, really clean it. I'm currently using a damp paper towel on this, but you can use whatever you want. I used to use a cloth. I just found that it was hard to get every particulate out of the cloth, so I was infesting my piece in between layers over time and then scratching it. I couldn't figure out where the scratches were coming from until I threw out the cloth and started using a disposable paper towel or something like a clean wipe or whatever. Generally you want some moisture on there so it picks up anything that doesn't mechanically come off. Now we are on to the 400 grit, and this is where I'm gonna end using emery cloth for this project, because aluminum's a very soft metal. It doesn't hold its surface very well, so a brushed look is actually where you want to finish, because it's probably one of the stronger finishes you can put on aluminum. Of course, you can always do a clear coat over it. I just like bare metal. It's nice and easy to fix, and then that way if somebody does scratch it, like for example, a big photographer oaf as he's doing his fancy setup for the intro video, dropping the giant steel display stand on it and marring it. That's why the picture has a big mar, is like I didn't have time to go back and fix the horn. The display stand is probably 20 pounds because I made it out of parts that my boss at my old job burned out at the wrong size, and it was out of 3/16 inch thick steel. So it was like, hey, that kind of looks like a piece of Cloud City on Bespin. It worked out pretty well. I'm not very happy with the grill. One day I'm going to go back and remake that grill. I think it should be deeper, but I only had about 20 minutes to make the grill. So I just fired up the iron worker, punched a bunch of holes, and then finished it with the angle grinder and painted it. Also, it's one of those things that I've probably watched Empire Strikes Back 100 times at this point, and never noticed that the grill that Luke Skywalker comes up out of from the lower levels isn't symmetrical. It's actually a rounded arc that goes about a third of the way to one side. So when I finished the grill, rewatched Empire, I was like, oh, I made that heinously wrong. I should remake that at some point. Oops. Here we are at the end. I really love how this brushed look came out. I generally love the finish of Scotch Brite. It's so hard to get perfect, but when you nail it, you really nail it. So if you can't be a good example, be a terrible warning.
Hey, this is Josh from Star Wars Escape Pod, the podcast. Come and check us out weekly everywhere you find podcasts. May the Force be with you.